At 3 o'clock in the morning, Lady Rosalind Ashton lay awake in the darkness of the ducal bedchamber, listening to her husband breathe. For the fourth night in 11 days, she heard it, the shift in rhythm, the softening of breath. And then the name, whispered with a tenderness she had never heard in 2 years of marriage. Eleanor. His hand reached across the sheet, fingers searching for someone who was not there, who had never been there. Rosalind's own hand pressed flat against the mattress, her heart counting the seconds until his breathing steadied again. Morning would come, as it always did, and she would ask the question she had been holding like a stone in her chest. And when she did, when she finally spoke the name aloud across the breakfast table, his cup would slip from his fingers and shatter on the floor, and the marriage she thought she understood would crack open like an egg, revealing something she had never been shown. The name came to her first in sleep, or rather, in the space between sleep and waking where the mind catalogues sounds without meaning. Rosalind had been married to Henry Ashton, Duke of Thornfield, for 2 years and 3 months. She knew the rhythm of his breathing, the way he turned toward the window in the early hours, the particular silence he carried through the halls of the estate. She knew he was kind to the tenants, that he remembered the names of servants' children, that he read correspondence at breakfast and rode out to inspect the northern fields every Thursday. She knew he had married her because her father was a solicitor whose practice extended into 3 counties, and because a duke required a competent wife who would manage his household without requiring his attention. She had accepted this. Her father, James Weston, had raised her among briefs and depositions, teaching her to read contracts and witness statements because he had no sons and needed an assistant. When the offer came from Thornfield, her father had presented it as the highest compliment she would ever receive, a duke who valued her competence. She had walked down the aisle understanding that she was a solution to someone else's problem, and she had trained herself to be grateful for it. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, lying in the dark, she heard her husband speak another woman's name with a tenderness that made her chest tighten. And she understood that her marriage contained a room she had never been shown. The first time, she thought she had imagined it. The second time, she told herself it was a dream, something surfacing from his sleep that meant nothing in daylight. The third time, she lay perfectly still and listened, her hand moving without decision to rest on his chest, feeling the vibration of the name in his body. The way he said it, Eleanor, was not the voice of a man remembering an old affection. It was the voice of a man speaking to someone who still occupied space in his waking hours, someone who mattered more than the woman lying beside him. On the 4th night, she did not touch him. She lay awake and counted his breaths and waited for morning. The breakfast room at Thornfield faced east, and the September light came through the tall windows in slanted gold. Rosalind poured tea with the precision she had learned from her mother, who had died when Rosalind was 16 and left behind a household that ran on schedules and measured gestures. Henry sat across from her, reading the Morning Post. He wore gray, as he always did, and his hands, long-fingered, careful, sorted letters into 2 piles with the efficiency of a man who had been managing an estate since his father's death 12 years ago. She set the teapot down. Her own hands were steady. She had practiced this moment in her mind for 4 days, choosing the words, measuring the tone. A solicitor's daughter understood that the first question shaped the entire interrogation. Her voice was calm. "Henry, who is Eleanor?" His hand stopped. The letter he was holding, something from the steward about the harvest, remained suspended in the air for 2 seconds. Then his other hand, the one holding the teacup halfway to his mouth, tilted. The cup slipped from his fingers. Porcelain shattered on the stone floor. Tea spread across the flags in a dark stain that reached the edge of the rug. He stared at the broken pieces, and his face, always so carefully composed, went white. Rosalind continued. You say her name at night, in your sleep. I have been listening for 11 days. Henry's jaw worked. No sound came. His hand, still extended where the cup had been, trembled. She asked quietly, Is she someone you love? 4 seconds passed. She counted them. His eyes met hers, and she saw something she'd never seen in 2 years of marriage. Not guilt, but something deeper. A man watching a door open that he had spent 12 years standing in front of. He began, Rosalind. She rose from the table. Then I will find out myself. She set her napkin beside her plate with the precision of a woman whose father had taught her that composure was the first tool and the last weapon. She walked to the door, her skirts brushing the edge of the spilled tea, and did not look back. Behind her, Henry did not move. His hand remained extended toward the cup that was no longer there, and the morning light fell across the table in a shape that looked like a cage. That evening, she asked again. They were in the drawing room, the fire burning low, the household settled into the quiet that came after dinner. Rosalind sat with her embroidery, a piece she had been working on for 6 months and would never finish. And Henry stood by the window, looking out at the darkening gardens. Her voice was steady. Who is Eleanor, Henry? He turned. His face in the firelight looked older than 32, the shadows carving lines she had never noticed before. He answered, A cousin. She lives with the Thornfield relations in Norfolk. He met her eyes when he said it. The lie was practiced. 12 years practiced. His hands did not shake. His voice did not falter. If Rosalind had not been trained to verify testimony, she might have believed him. She repeated, A cousin. He confirmed. Yes. What is her full name? Eleanor Thornfield. And she lives in Norfolk? He nodded. Yes. Rosalind set down her embroidery. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him across the room, across the distance that had always existed between them and was now a chasm. She said simply, Thank you. He nodded, turned back to the window. The conversation was over, and the lie hung in the air between them like smoke. 3 days later, Rosalind wrote to the Thornfield cousins in Norfolk, a casual letter, the kind a duchess might send to relations she had never met, inquiring after their health and mentioning that she had heard of a cousin named Eleanor. She sealed it herself and gave it to the post without telling Henry. The reply arrived a week later. Rosalind opened it in her sitting room, alone, with the morning light falling across the desk where she managed the household accounts. The letter began, Dear Rosalind, we are delighted to hear from you and hope this letter finds you well. However, we must confess some confusion regarding your inquiry. We have no relation named Eleanor, dear Rosalind. You must be mistaken. Perhaps Henry was referring to a connection on his mother's side. We remain, as always, yes, your devoted cousins. Rosalind read the letter twice. Then she set it down on the desk and sat very still, her hands flat on the polished wood, feeling the weight of a lie that had just revealed itself. A solicitor's daughter knew what to do when testimony contradicted. She verified the facts. She followed the thread. She did not confront the witness until she had evidence that could not be denied. She opened the household ledger and began to read. It took her 3 hours to find the pattern. Henry traveled to Bath on the 14th of every month. The entries were there in her own handwriting. She managed the accounts, after all, but she had never questioned them. A duke had business. A duke traveled. The 14th of every month, without fail, Henry left Thornfield after breakfast and returned before dinner. He took the small carriage, the one that did not require a full staff, and he carried a leather case she had seen him pack, but never examined. Rosalind closed the ledger. She sat in the quiet of her sitting room and understood that her husband had been visiting someone in Bath once a month, for as long as she had known him, and possibly longer, someone he lied about. Someone whose name he spoke in his sleep, with a tenderness that made her chest ache. She would follow him. The 14th of September arrived with gray skies and the threat of rain. Henry left after breakfast, as he always did, carrying the leather case. Rosalind watched from the window of her sitting room as the carriage pulled away down the long drive, and then she went to find Mrs. Calloway, the housekeeper. Rosalind said, "I need the small carriage prepared. I'm going to Bath." Mrs. Calloway, who had been at Thornfield for 30 years and knew better than to ask questions, nodded. "When shall I tell His Grace you will return, my lady?" Rosalind answered, "Before dinner." And Mrs. Calloway, "Please do not mention this to His Grace when he returns." The housekeeper's face remained perfectly neutral. "Of course, my lady." 2 hours later, Rosalind sat in the carriage on the road to Bath, watching the countryside roll past in shades of green and gold. She had told the driver to follow the usual route, the one Henry would have taken, and she carried a letter in her reticule addressed to a modiste in Bath. A plausible excuse if anyone asked why the Duchess had traveled alone to the city. But no one would ask. She was a Duchess. She could go where she pleased. The road to Bath took 4 hours. Rosalind spent them thinking about lies and marriages and the particular loneliness of being married to a man who spoke another woman's name in his sleep. She thought about her father, who had raised her to be useful, and about Henry, who had married her for the same reason. She thought about the word capable, which Henry had used to describe her twice in 2 years, and how she had trained herself to accept it as the highest compliment she would ever receive. By the time the carriage reached Bath, the gray skies had opened into rain. The driver knew the city. He had driven Henry here a dozen times, and Rosalind asked him to follow the route the Duke usually took. They wound through the streets of Bath, past the assembly rooms and the crescents of white stone, until they reached the outskirts where the city gave way to fields and the houses stood farther apart. The carriage stopped outside a pair of iron gates. Beyond them, set back from the road, stood a Georgian building with clipped hedges and tall windows. The sign beside the gates read, "Willowbank House, private establishment for the care of ladies of gentle birth." Rosalind stared at the sign. Then she looked at the building, at the bars visible on the lower windows, half hidden by the careful landscaping. Her hands tightened in her lap. She told the driver, "Wait here." She did not enter. Not that day. She sat in the carriage outside the iron gates and watched. An hour passed. Then 2. The rain continued, soft and steady, and the windows of Willowbank House remained dark except for a few lights on the upper floors. At 3 o'clock, Henry's carriage appeared in the drive. Rosalind watched as he stepped out, carrying the leather case, and walked to the door. A woman in a gray dress, a nurse perhaps, or housekeeper, opened it and let him inside. Rosalind waited. 3 hours later, as the afternoon light began to fade, the door opened again and Henry emerged. He walked to his carriage slowly, and even from the distance of the road, Rosalind could see the way his shoulders bent, the way he moved like a man who had left part of himself behind. She watched his carriage pull away down the drive and turn toward Thornfield. Then she instructed her driver to take her home. That night, she did not sleep. She lay beside Henry in the dark and listened to his breathing. And when he whispered, "Eleanor," at 3 o'clock in the morning, she did not flinch. Not. She knew now where Eleanor was. She did not yet know who she was, or why Henry visited her once a month in a place designed to keep women locked away from the world. But she would find out. The next morning, Rosalind sat at her desk and wrote to her father. She did not mention names. She did not mention Thornfield. She described, in careful legal language, a hypothetical case. A woman committed to a private sanatorium, visited monthly by a family member, confined for reasons unknown. She asked about the legal process for commitment, about the rights of patients, about the role of examining physicians. Her father's reply arrived 4 days later. It was thorough, detailed, and written in the same precise hand that had taught her to read contracts when she was 12 years old. He wrote, "My dear Rosalind, the case you describe is not uncommon, though it is rarely challenged. A woman may be committed to a private establishment on the testimony of 2 physicians and the signature of a family member. Once committed, she has very little legal recourse unless someone petitions on her behalf. The examining physician's credentials are critical. If the physician was later discredited or struck from the register, the commitment papers may be contestable. I would need to see the documents to advise further." "Why do you ask?" Rosalind folded the letter and placed it in the locked drawer of her desk. Then she made her decision. She would return to Willowbank, alone, and this time she would go inside. The following week, Rosalind traveled to Bath again. This time she did not follow Henry. She went on a Wednesday, 3 days before his usual visit, and she went with a purpose. She wore her finest day dress, the deep blue silk that marked her as a woman of rank, and she carried her card case. When the carriage stopped outside the iron gates of Willowbank House, she stepped out and walked to the door, as though she had every right to be there. A woman answered her knock, the same gray-dressed woman Rosalind had seen admit Henry. She was perhaps 50, with a face that had learned not to show surprise. Rosalind said, "Good afternoon. I am Lady Rosalind Ashton, Duchess of Thornfield. I am here to visit one of your residents." The woman's expression shifted slightly. "Your Grace, we were not expecting—" Rosalind interrupted. "I do not require an appointment to visit a member of my own family. Please inform Mr. Marsh that I am here to see Lady Eleanor Ashton." The name landed like a stone in water. The woman's face went still. She replied, "Of course, Your Grace. Please, come in." The interior of Willowbank House smelled of carbolic soap and lavender. The floors were polished, the walls painted a pale green that might have been soothing if not for the locked doors visible down every corridor. Rosalind followed the woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Palmer, the head nurse, up a staircase and down a long hallway. The windows were tall but barred, and the light that came through them fell in slanted lines that looked like cages. Mrs. Palmer stopped outside a door near the end of the hall and knocked softly. She said, "Lady Eleanor, you have a visitor." A voice from inside, low and clear, replied, "Henry is not due until Saturday." "It is not his Grace, my lady. It is the Duchess." Silence. Then the voice said, "Send her in." Mrs. Palmer opened the door and stepped aside. Rosalind entered, and the door closed softly behind her. The room was small but not unkind. A bed, a chair, a writing desk by the window. But what struck Rosalind first was the books. Hundreds of them, stacked on every surface, lining the walls in precarious towers. And on the desk, drawings, dozens of them, all of the same view. The garden visible from the window, rendered in charcoal with careful, precise lines. Except the most recent drawings were different. The lines were looser, less controlled. The precision was gone. A woman sat in the chair by the window. She was perhaps 26, with dark hair pulled back from a face that might have been beautiful, if not for the exhaustion carved into every line. She wore a simple gray dress, and her hands, resting in her lap, trembled slightly. She looked up at Rosalind, and her eyes were Henry's eyes. The same gray, the same shape, the same way of looking at someone as though cataloging what they might need before they asked for it. The woman said, "You are not Henry?" Rosalind replied, "No, I am his wife." "He mentioned you once. He said you were capable." The word landed with a weight that made Rosalind's chest tighten. "He says it the way one describes a good horse." Rosalind stood in the doorway, her hands folded in front of her, and made a decision. She crossed the room and sat on the floor, not in the visitor's chair, but on the floor with her back against the door. Because the visitor's chair was designed for people who left. Eleanor watched her with an expression Rosalind could not quite name. Then slowly, something in her face shifted. Rosalind said, "I heard him say your name at night, in his sleep, at 3 o'clock in the morning. I've been listening for nearly 2 weeks." Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. "He comes every month. 12 books, 3 hours. He has done this for 12 years, and I am still in this room." Rosalind asked, "What has changed?" Eleanor looked at the brown glass bottle on the nightstand. "Dr. Alderton increased my dosage 3 weeks ago, after a bad episode. My hands shake now. I cannot hold the charcoal properly. My speech slurs by evening. Henry saw it on his last visit. He was—" She paused, searching for the word. Frightened is the wrong word for my brother. He became very still. Rosalind asked, "When is the next increase?" 6 weeks. Alderton calls it titration. He is increasing the dose until I am—" Eleanor's voice faltered. "Manageable." Rosalind felt something cold settle in her chest. "The physician who signed your original commitment papers." "What was his name?" Eleanor answered. "Prayed. Dr. Josiah Prayed." "He was struck from the medical register," Rosalind said, 4 years ago, for illegitimate committals." Eleanor went completely still. The tremor in her hands stopped. The fog in her eyes lifted, not medically, but from within. Something sharp and alive breaking through. She asked, "My brother has known this?" Rosalind said, "I do not know yet. If he knew and still brought books instead of a solicitor." Rosalind interrupted. "Then I will bring the solicitor." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 12 years of locked doors and monthly visits, and a name whispered in the dark by a man who had never filed the one document that could have freed his sister. Eleanor picked up a piece of charcoal. Her hands shook, but she held it anyway, pressing it against a fresh sheet of paper. The line that emerged was unsteady, wavering, nothing like the precise drawings that covered the desk. Eleanor said, "I have a request. When you stand before a magistrate, I want to be present, not described, present. I have spent 12 years being spoken about by people who call it care. I want to speak." Rosalind replied, "You will, but the laudanum must clear first." Eleanor said, "Then we have 6 weeks. Rosalind corrected her. "We have less. But my father is faster than your brother." Eleanor looked at her, this woman who had sat on the floor instead of in the visitor's chair, who had followed a name whispered in the dark to a locked room in Bath, who spoke like someone who understood that silence was not neutrality, but architecture. Eleanor asked, "Why are you doing this?" Rosalind thought of her marriage, of the word capable of lying awake at 3 a.m, listening to her husband love someone else. She thought of her father teaching her to read commitment orders because he needed an assistant, and of walking down an aisle, understanding she was a solution to someone else's problem. Rosalind answered, "Because I am tired of being useful, and because you asked me to." Rosalind confronted Henry that night. Not in the drawing room, not at breakfast, but in the corridor outside the estate office, where he could not sit behind a desk and pretend this was a conversation about household management. She stepped in front of him as he walked toward the stairs, and he stopped, his hand still on the banister. Her voice was low and steady. "Eleanor is your sister. She is in a sanatorium in Bath. She has been there for 12 years. The physician who signed her commitment papers was struck from the medical register for illegitimate committals. And Dr. Alderton is increasing her laudanum until she cannot testify to her own competence. You have 6 weeks before the next increase, possibly fewer." Henry's back hit the wall, not from the force of her words, but because his legs would not hold him. His face went white, and his hands, those careful, gentle hands, pressed flat against the wallpaper as though he needed something solid to keep him upright. He began, "I have been trying to find a way." Rosalind said, "You have been trying for 12 years. I have been trying for 10 days. Your sister asked me to bring a solicitor. I am bringing my father." Henry protested, "If the petition is public—" Rosalind interrupted. "The petition is public. That is the only form it takes. Your private letters have accomplished nothing. Your monthly visits have accomplished nothing. The woman I met yesterday cannot hold a charcoal pencil because a physician is drugging her into incompetence before anyone can prove she's competent. Public is the only option left." Henry's jaw worked. His eyes, gray like Eleanor's, gray like the morning light through barred windows, met hers, and she saw the weight he had been carrying for 12 years, the impossible equation he had been trying to solve alone. His voice broke. "Rosalind, did you marry me because your father is a solicitor?" She had not expected the question. It landed in her chest like a blow, and for a moment she could not answer. Then she stepped closer, close enough that he could not look away. She asked, "Did you marry me because somewhere you have not examined? You knew that what Eleanor needed was not your devotion, but my father's practice?" He could not answer. She watched him try and fail, and she understood that the marriage she had thought was built on convenience had been built on something else entirely. A hope he had never named. A door he had been standing in front of for 12 years, waiting for someone to open it from the other side. Rosalind said, "We leave for Bath tomorrow, together, in the carriage. You will tell me everything, every physician, every solicitor, every letter, every visit. 12 years. By the time we reach Willowbank, I will have a legal strategy, and you will have done the one thing you have not done in 12 years. Henry asked, "What is that?" She answered, "Asked for help." The carriage to Bath left at dawn. Rosalind sat across from Henry with a leather folder of notes balanced on her lap. And before the estate was out of sight, she had opened it and taken out her pen. She said, "Start at the beginning. How old was Eleanor when she was committed?" Henry's voice was hoarse. 14. She had her first seizure at 13. The family physician, Dr. Pred, diagnosed hereditary nervous hysteria. My father... He stopped, his hands tightening on his knees. My father believed reputation was the only wealth that mattered. Pred recommended institutional commitment. 2 other physicians recommended home management. My father chose the recommendation that made the problem invisible. Rosalind asked. How old were you? She was writing in the shorthand her father had taught her, the letters flowing across the page in swift, precise strokes. Henry answered. 20, I protested. My father gave me a choice. Sign as witnessing family member or lose the succession and all access to Eleanor. I signed. Rosalind's pen paused. You were 20 years old, and your father forced you to choose between your inheritance and your sister. He confirmed. Yes. And you chose the inheritance. Henry said. I chose the ability to visit her. If I had refused, I would have lost everything. I would never have seen her again. I thought. He looked out the window at the passing fields, at the morning light on the hills. I thought I could fix it later. I thought I could petition once my father died. But by the time he died, Eleanor had been in Willowbank for 7 years. 7 years of telling her I would find a way. 7 years of books and promises and walking out through a door she could not follow me through. Rosalind wrote. The pen moved across the page, capturing every detail, every name, every date. The carriage rocked gently on the road, and the 4 hours stretched ahead of them like a space where truth could finally be told. She asked, Why did you not file a petition after your father died? Henry said, I tried. I consulted 3 solicitors. They all said the same thing. A public petition would expose the family. The county would know. The Dowager would be devastated. And Eleanor, his voice broke. Eleanor might face the hearing in a state that made her appear incompetent. Praed's diagnosis was still on record. The risk was that the magistrate would uphold the commitment, and then I would have exposed her for nothing. Rosalind said, So you did nothing? Henry replied, I visited, every month, 12 books. I thought if I kept her mind sharp, if I kept her connected to the world outside, eventually there would be a moment when the risk was smaller. But the moment never came. And now Alderton is drugging her toward incompetence, and the window is closing while I am still calculating whether it is safe to act. Rosalind looked up from her notes. Henry's face in the morning light was the face of a man who had spent 12 years trying to solve an impossible problem and had just realized he had been solving the wrong equation. She said, You married a solicitor's daughter and spent 2 years complimenting her household management. The most useful thing about me is the thing you never asked about. Henry said quietly, I know. Rosalind continued, Then stop knowing and start instructing me. Who is Dr. Alderton? Henry told her. Alderton had been Praed's student, had taken over Eleanor's care after Praed left the practice, had never questioned the original diagnosis. He was not malicious. He was simply a physician who had inherited a patient and a set of assumptions and had never examined either. Rosalind asked, What does Eleanor's typical day look like? Henry answered, She wakes at 7, breakfast at past. She reads from 8 until noon. She walks in the garden, 40 paces by 22, she measured it once, for an hour in the afternoon. She draws. She has drawn the view from her window approximately 400 times. She has had 109 episodes in 12 years. Each lasts between 2 and 7 minutes. Between episodes, she is the person you met. Rosalind wrote it all down. The routine, the books, the drawings, the measurements. The life of a woman who had been confined for 12 years and had spent those years proving, over and over, that she did not belong there. She asked, When did Alderton increase the laudanum? Henry said, 3 weeks ago. Eleanor had a severe episode, longer than usual, more violent. Alderton increased the dose immediately. When I visited last week, I saw the effects. Her speech was slurred, her hands shook. She could not draw. She looked at me and said, "Henry, I am disappearing." The pen in Rosalind's hand stilled. She looked at Henry, at the way his hands gripped his knees, at the 12 years of guilt and helplessness carved into his face. Rosalind said, "She is not disappearing. She is being erased. There is a difference. Disappearing is passive. Erasure is something done to you, and it can be stopped." They reached the halfway point. The driver stopped to rest the horses, and Rosalind and Henry stepped out into the morning air. They stood on the side of the road, the field stretching away on either side, and Rosalind felt the weight of what she was about to do settle into her bones. She said, "If we file this petition, the county will know. Your mother will know. Everyone will know that the Duke of Thornfield's sister has been confined for 12 years under papers signed by a disbarred physician. Your family's name will be examined in a public courtroom. Do you understand what that means?" Henry answered, "Yes." "And you are willing to accept it?" He said, "I should have accepted it 12 years ago." Rosalind looked at him. This man who had married her for convenience, who had never asked her about the one thing she was trained to do, who had whispered his sister's name in his sleep because his waking mind could not solve the equation. She said, "Then we will do this together. But you need to understand something. I am not doing this because I am your wife. I am doing this because your sister asked me to, and because I am tired of watching people who love each other visit instead of act." Henry's eyes met hers, and for the first time in 2 years of marriage, he saw her truly look at her, not at the capable Duchess who managed his household, but at the woman who had followed a name whispered in the dark and had found a locked door and had decided to open it. He said, "I do not deserve you." Rosalind agreed. "No, but your sister does. So let us get back in the carriage and finish this." They climbed back in, and the driver urged the horses forward. The road to Bath unwound ahead of them, and Rosalind returned to her notes. She asked questions, and Henry answered. The alliance formed not at a desk at midnight, but in motion. Urgency, daylight, the sound of wheels on the road, and the scratch of a pen that knew exactly what it was writing. By the time they reached Willowbank, Rosalind had filled 20 pages with notes. She had the names of every physician, every solicitor, every person who had touched Eleanor's case in 12 years. She had the dates, the diagnoses, the increases in medication. She had the structure of a legal argument that would dismantle 12 years of institutional inertia and force a magistrate to see what everyone had chosen to ignore. A woman who did not belong in a locked room, being drugged into silence by people who called it care. They entered Willowbank together. Mrs. Palmer met them in the entrance hall, her face carefully neutral. She said to Henry, "Your Grace." Then to Rosalind, "Your Grace, Lady Eleanor is in her room." Rosalind said, "We will see her together." They climbed the stairs and walked down the long corridor with its barred windows and locked doors. Henry knocked softly on Eleanor's door. He said, "Eleanor, it is Henry and Rosalind." The door opened. Eleanor stood in the threshold, her hands trembling, her eyes sharp despite the laudanum fog. She looked at Rosalind first, then at Henry. She observed, "You came together." Rosalind confirmed, "Yes, and we are going to file the petition, but we need to know. Can you speak clearly for 20 minutes at 10 o'clock in the morning?" Eleanor's hands shook, but her voice was steady. "At 10 I am sharp. By 2 I am not." Rosalind said, "Then we schedule the hearing for 10, and you will speak. Not be spoken about, speak." Eleanor looked at her brother, at the man who had visited for 12 years and had never brought a solicitor. at the man whose wife had sat on the floor and had promised to bring one. She said, "I am ready." The Dowager Duchess of Thornfield arrived at the estate 3 days after the bath visit. Rosalind was in her sitting room, writing to her father with the details Henry had provided, when Mrs. Calloway knocked and announced the visitor. The housekeeper said, "The Dowager is here, Your Grace. She is in the drawing room and wishes to speak with you immediately." Rosalind set down her pen. She had known this moment would come. Mr. Marsh, the director of Willowbank, would have written to the Dowager the moment Rosalind visited Eleanor. The institutional machinery was already in motion. The Dowager sat in the drawing room with her hands folded in her lap. She was 61, dressed in gray silk, and her face was the face of a woman who had spent 12 years building a wall around her grief and had just learned someone was about to tear it down. The Dowager said, "You went to Willowbank?" It was not a question. Rosalind confirmed. "Yes." She sat across from her mother-in-law and met her gaze without flinching. "Mr. Marsh wrote to me. He said you visited Eleanor, that you intend to file a petition." Rosalind said, "I do." The Dowager's hands tightened in her lap. "You do not understand what you are doing. A public petition will destroy this family. The county will know. Everyone will know what we—" Her voice broke. "What I did." Rosalind said, "You signed the commitment papers." It was not an accusation. It was a fact. The Dowager said, "I signed because my husband gave me a choice. Sign or lose all visiting rights. If I did not sign, I would never have seen Eleanor again. I chose to sign so that I could still visit her, so that she would not be completely alone." Rosalind absorbed this. The Dowager's signature on the papers had not been a choice. It had been coercion. But the result was the same. Eleanor had been locked away, and the Dowager had visited once a year on her birthday, bringing chrysanthemums. Rosalind asked, "When did you last visit Eleanor?" The Dowager answered, "Her birthday, June. I brought chrysanthemums." "Does she like chrysanthemums?" The Dowager's face went still. I do not know. I have always brought chrysanthemums." Rosalind said, "She likes peonies. She told me so when I visited. She said she stopped liking chrysanthemums when she was 16. But no one ever asked." What followed was not silence, but the sound of years collapsing. 12 annual visits. Flowers chosen by habit rather than inquiry, affection that had never paused to listen. The Dowager said, and her voice was barely audible, 3 years ago, Eleanor asked me to stop coming. She said the annual visit was the cruelest day she endured, a reminder that the outside world existed and had chosen to visit rather than to act. She asked me to stop coming or to free her. I could do neither. So I brought chrysanthemums she did not want to a woman who asked me not to come. Rosalind felt something crack open in her chest. The Dowager's visits, like Henry's, had been for the visitor's comfort, not the patient's. Eleanor had been asking the people who loved her to either act or leave her in peace, and they had chosen neither. They had chosen chrysanthemums and books and the particular cruelty of love that witnesses suffering but does not end it. Rosalind said, "Your grandson's physician is drugging your daughter into incompetence. In 6 weeks, she will not be able to testify. You can oppose this petition, or you can write to Mr. Marsh and demand that they halt the dosage increase. One of those actions is a mother's. The other is a signature." The Dowager looked at her, this young woman who had married into the family 2 years ago, who had followed a name whispered in the dark and had decided to dismantle 12 years of silence. She asked, "If I write to Marsh, will it stop the petition?" Rosalind answered, "No. The petition will be filed. But if you write to Marsh, you will be acting instead of witnessing. For the first time in 12 years. The Dowager's hands shook. She pressed them together, and Rosalind watched the wall around her grief begin to crack. The Dowager said, "I will write to him tonight." Rosalind replied, "Good, because your daughter does not need your chrysanthemums. She needs you to fight." That evening, the Dowager sat at the writing desk in the guest room and wrote to Mr. Marsh. Not to block the petition, to demand that Dr. Alderton halt Eleanor's laudanum increase pending a family review of her care. It was not courage. Not yet. But it was the first step before courage. The admission that silence had never been neutrality. It had been architecture. Mr. Marsh did not comply. The Dowager's letter was a request, not a legal order. And Marsh had spent 20 years running Willowbank on the principle that families who wanted difficult questions to go away were willing to pay £200 per annum for the privilege. He responded to the Dowager with polite regret. Dr. Alderton's medical judgment remains the authority within this establishment. We appreciate your concern, but Lady Eleanor's care will proceed as planned. Simultaneously, Marsh wrote to 3 other families with daughters in Willowbank, warning them that legal challenges to commitment proceedings created precedents that might affect all families with dependents in care. The institutional machinery mobilized. Marsh was not cruel. He was a businessman protecting 19 patients at £200 each. The system did not need malice. It only needed profit. Dr. Alderton, at Marsh's request, prepared a counter-assessment. Lady Eleanor Ashton presents with worsening neurological episodes requiring increased pharmaceutical management. Continued institutional care is medically indicated. Independent assessment would be inadvisable given the patient's fragile state. Rosalind received a copy of the assessment a week later. She read it in her sitting room with Henry standing by the window, and when she finished, she set it down on the desk with the careful precision of a woman about to dismantle an argument. Line by line. Rosalind said, "Alderton has never independently assessed Eleanor. He inherited Pride's diagnosis and has been treating her based on notes written by a disbarred physician. This counter-assessment is circular reasoning. He is claiming she requires sedation because she is fragile, and she is fragile because he has been sedating her." Henry asked, "Can we prove that?" Rosalind answered, "My father can. He will cross-examine Alderton in the hearing, and Eleanor will testify. The magistrate will see the difference between a physician's assumptions and a patient's reality." The petition was filed by James Weston on the 23rd of September. The hearing was scheduled for 4 weeks hence, the 21st of October. 2 weeks before Dr. Alderton's planned dosage increase, Rosalind and Henry visited Eleanor 3 days after the petition was filed. They found her in her room, reading aloud to herself from a volume of Shakespeare. Her hands shook as she turned the pages, but her voice was clear. Eleanor said when they entered, "I am practicing. If I read aloud for 2 hours every morning, my speech stays sharp until afternoon. By evening it slurs, but the hearing is at 10. I will be ready." Rosalind sat on the floor, her back against the door, and watched Eleanor read. Henry sat in the visitor's chair, his hands folded in his lap, and for the first time in 12 years, he was not bringing books. He was watching his sister fight with the only weapon she had left, her voice. Rosalind said when Eleanor paused, "The hearing is in 4 weeks. Alderton will testify that you require increased sedation. My father will cross-examine him, and then you will speak. You will tell the magistrate what your life has been for 12 years. Can you do that?" Eleanor looked at her hands. They trembled against the book's spine. "My hands may not be steady." Rosalind said, "Your hands do not need to be steady. Your mind does. Can you speak clearly for 20 minutes at 10 in the morning?" Eleanor confirmed. "Yes." Rosalind said. "Then that is what you will do." Eleanor closed the book and set it on the desk. She looked at Rosalind, then at Henry, and her face, exhausted, determined, still sharp despite the laudanum, held something that looked like hope. Eleanor said, "I want to walk through the front door of the courthouse. Not the side entrance, not the servant's door, the front." Rosalind promised, "You will, and afterward, you will walk through the front door of Willowbank one last time, to leave." The magistrate's court in Bath was a building of gray stone and tall windows, and on the morning of the 21st of October, the entrance hall filled with people who had come to witness the hearing. Word had spread. A duke's sister confined for 12 years, challenging her commitment in open court. The county wanted to watch. Rosalind arrived with Henry and the Dowager at 9:30. Her father, James Weston, met them in the entrance hall. He was 61, with silver hair and the calm, precise manner of a man who had spent 40 years in courtrooms and knew exactly how to dismantle a weak argument. Weston said, "The magistrate is Aldous Gray, fair-minded but conservative. He will not vacate the commitment unless Eleanor demonstrates clear capacity. Alderton will testify first. I will cross-examine. Then Eleanor speaks." The Dowager asked, her voice tight with fear, "Is she ready?" Rosalind said, "She has been ready for 12 years. Today she gets to prove it." At 10 o'clock, the courtroom doors opened. The magistrate entered, and everyone rose. Rosalind sat at the solicitor's table with her father. Henry and the Dowager sat behind them. Across the aisle, Mr. Marsh sat with Dr. Alderton and a London solicitor whose presence announced that Willowbank was taking this challenge seriously. The magistrate called the court to order. "We are here to consider a petition for the vacation of a commitment order issued 12 years ago for Lady Eleanor Ashton. Mr. Weston, you may proceed." James Weston stood. "Your Honor, we petition for the immediate vacation of Lady Eleanor's commitment on the grounds that the original order was obtained under false pretenses, that the examining physician was later struck from the medical register for professional misconduct, and that the patient has been subjected to inappropriate pharmaceutical intervention designed to impair her capacity to challenge the order." The magistrate nodded. "Mr. Alderton, you may present your assessment." Dr. Alderton took the stand. He was perhaps 50, with thinning hair and the careful, neutral expression of a man who had testified in these proceedings before. He described Eleanor's condition in clinical terms: hereditary nervous hysteria, episodic seizures, progressive deterioration requiring increased pharmaceutical management. The magistrate asked, "In your professional opinion, does Lady Eleanor require continued institutional care?" Alderton answered, "Yes, Your Honor. Her condition is worsening. Independent living would be inadvisable and potentially dangerous." James Weston rose for cross-examination. "Dr. Alderton, when did you first examine Lady Eleanor?" Alderton replied, "I assumed her care 7 years ago, when Dr. Praed retired from practice." "Did you conduct an independent assessment at that time, or did you rely on Dr. Praed's original diagnosis?" Alderton hesitated. "I reviewed Dr. Praed's notes and found them thorough. An independent assessment was not necessary. Dr. Praed was struck from the medical register 4 years ago for signing illegitimate commitment orders. Were you aware of this?" Alderton said, "I was aware of his later difficulties, yes." "And yet you continue to treat Lady Eleanor based on his diagnosis without conducting your own examination?" Alderton began, and I saw no reason to question. "You have treated this patient for 7 years based on the diagnosis of a physician who was professionally discredited for the very act that placed her in your care. Is that your testimony?" Silence. Alderton's face flushed. I have observed her condition over 7 years. Have you ever, in those 7 years, conducted an assessment that did not begin with the assumption that Dr. Preed's diagnosis was correct? Alderton admitted, No. Weston said, no further questions. The magistrate made a note. Call your next witness, Mr. Weston. Weston announced, the petitioner calls Lady Eleanor Ashton. The courtroom went silent. The door at the side of the room opened, and Eleanor entered. She wore a gray dress, simple, well cut, and her hands trembled as she walked to the witness chair. But her eyes were clear, and when she sat, she looked directly at the magistrate. The magistrate said, Lady Eleanor, you understand that you are here to testify regarding your commitment? Eleanor confirmed. Yes, Your Honor. Please describe your typical day at Willowbank House. Eleanor took a breath. Her hands gripped the arms of the chair. And Rosalind, watching from the solicitor's table, saw the effort it took to keep her voice steady. Eleanor said, I wake at 7 o'clock. Breakfast is at past. I read from 8 until noon. I have read 3,714 books in 12 years. I walk in the garden for 1 hour each afternoon. The garden measures 40 paces by 22. I have drawn the view from my window approximately 400 times. I have had 109 episodes in 12 years. Each episode lasts between 2 and 7 minutes. Between episodes, I am the person you see before you. The magistrate leaned forward. You have counted the books you have read. Eleanor answered, Yes, Your Honor. I have also counted the days. 4,380. I have counted them because counting is the only way to prove that time is passing when every day is the same. Eleanor held up her hands. They shook visibly. 3 months ago, my hands did not shake. They shake now because Dr. Alderton increased my laudanum after my last episode. The medication prescribed to manage my condition is managing me. It is making me quieter, slower, easier to ignore. In 2 weeks, at the next scheduled increase, I will not be able to give this testimony. My hands will not hold a pen. My speech will slur. I will become the person Dr. Alderton describes in his assessment, not because my condition has worsened, but because the medication has made me incompetent. She looked directly at the magistrate. I am here today because a woman I met 1 month ago understood that the window was closing and acted faster than the people who have loved me for 12 years. I am here because she sat on the floor of my room and promised to bring a solicitor. I am here because she kept that promise. The courtroom was utterly silent. Rosalind felt Henry's hand find hers under the table, and she held it tightly. The magistrate looked at the commitment papers in front of him, at Dr. Alderton's counter-assessment, at Eleanor, sitting in the witness chair with trembling hands, and a voice that cut through 12 years of institutional inertia like a blade. The magistrate said, Mr. Marsh, does the family oppose this petition? The Dowager solicitor stood. Rosalind held her breath. The solicitor said, The family does not oppose. Marsh's solicitor attempted to intervene. Your Honor, the establishment's medical authority. The magistrate interrupted. The establishment's medical authority rests on the diagnosis of a physician who was struck from the register for professional misconduct. The current physician has admitted he has never conducted an independent assessment. The patient before me has demonstrated a level of capacity and self-awareness that I find more than adequate. He looked at Eleanor. Lady Eleanor, the commitment order is vacated. You are free to leave Willowbank House immediately. Eleanor stood. For a moment she swayed, and Rosalind thought she might fall. But then she steadied herself, and she walked, slowly, carefully, to the main door of the courtroom. She opened it herself and stepped through into the entrance hall, where the May sunlight fell through the tall windows in slanted gold. On the courthouse steps, Eleanor stopped. She lifted her face to the sky and breathed. Henry stood beside her. His face was the face of a man watching his sister walk through a door he should have opened 12 years ago, and the weight of that failure was carved into every line. Eleanor said, "Do not apologize." She did not look at him. "I do not need your regret. Walk beside me." She turned to Rosalind, took her hand. The grip was strong despite the tremor. Eleanor said, "You sat on my floor. You counted the weeks. You told me my hands did not need to be steady." Rosalind replied, "Your mind needed to be steady. It was." Eleanor held her hand for a long moment. Then she released it and walked down the courthouse steps, into the street, into the world she had not stood in for 12 years. 3 hours after the hearing, the carriage returned to Willowbank House. Not for Eleanor to stay, but for Eleanor to leave properly. Mrs. Palmer had packed Eleanor's belongings. 312 books, 400 drawings, the charcoal set Henry had brought on his 6th visit. The empty brown laudanum bottle, washed and kept as evidence. Eleanor walked through the halls of Willowbank one last time. Past the locked doors, past the barred windows, past the rooms where other women still waited for someone to sit on the floor and promise to bring a solicitor. At the iron gates, she stopped. The gates she had entered at 14, crying, holding a copy of A Midsummer Night's Dream because no one had told her she could not bring it. The gates were open. She walked through them from the inside to the outside, and the 4 steps between the gravel drive and the public road measured the distance between 12 years of confinement and the rest of her life. She stopped on the road, looked both ways. She had not stood on a public road since she was 14. She asked, "Which way is Thornfield?" Henry answered, "East." Eleanor turned east and began walking, not toward the carriage. Walking, the road under her feet, the sky open above her, the grass at the road's edge growing wild and unmeasured. After 50 yards, she stopped, knelt, touched the grass with both hands. She said, "The grass is wet," Rosalind said. "It rained this morning." Eleanor looked up. Her face was wet too, not from rain, but from tears she had not been able to cry in a room where crying meant increased medication. She said, "I could hear the rain through the windows. I have listened to rain I could not stand in for 12 years." She stayed on the ground, wet knees, wet hands. The sky open above her, the first sky she had seen without a window frame since she was 14. Henry knelt beside her. Not because he understood, because she was on the ground and he would not stand above her. Rosalind stood back. She let them have this moment. The solicitor's daughter who had brought the law. The Duke who had brought 12 years of books. The woman who had walked through a gate and knelt in the wet grass and felt the rain on her hands for the first time in 12 years. Then Eleanor stood. She looked at the carriage, at the road stretching east toward Thornfield, at the sky that did not end at a wall. She said, "I am ready." They climbed into the carriage, and the driver urged the horses forward. Eleanor sat by the window, watching the fields roll past, watching the trees that did not end at a gate, watching the world she had been removed from and was now returning to. Rosalind sat across from her and watched her watch the world. Henry sat beside Rosalind, his hand finding hers in the space between them, holding it like proof that closed things eventually opened. 6 weeks later, the Thornfield garden blazed with autumn color. Eleanor sat on a bench Henry had built badly. He held a hammer the way he held a pen, which was to say not well, and drew the oak tree visible from the road, the tree she had passed the day she walked out of Willowbank and knelt in the wet grass. Her hands were steadier. The laudanum was clearing week by week, and the lines of her drawing no longer wavered. The precision was returning. Rosalind crossed the lawn with a letter. The medical register has published the correction. Your name has been removed from Praed's case records. Eleanor set down her charcoal. My name should not have been in his case records. Rosalind agreed. No. But now it is gone. And 2 families in London have cited the Thornfield petition in their own cases. My father is advising one of them. Eleanor looked at her. Your father treats me as though I am a person with ideas. Rosalind said, My father treats everyone that way. It is why he has no wealthy clients. Eleanor replied, It is why he has a daughter who filed a petition against a duke's family from the duke's own carriage. Henry arrived from the house carrying a cup of tea. He had made Eleanor tea every day for 6 weeks, and the tea was improving. Slowly. Eleanor said after the first sip, This one has too much sugar. Henry said, I am calibrating. Eleanor replied, You have been calibrating for 6 weeks. Henry said, Eleanor, I calibrated your book deliveries for 7 years. Allow me time with beverages. She took the tea, drank it, set it on the bench beside the drawing. There's a concert at the Assembly Rooms Thursday I would like to attend. Henry's face went still. You may have an episode. Eleanor said, I may. I would rather have an episode as a free woman in an assembly room than not have one in a locked room at Willowbank. The risk is mine. Rosalind smiled. Thursday, I will arrange the carriage. Henry opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. He looked at his sister, at his wife, at the 2 women who had dismantled 12 years of institutional silence in 4 weeks. And he understood that his role now was not to protect, but to witness. He said, I will sit beside you and be visible. Eleanor replied, Good. She picked up the charcoal and returned to the oak tree. The lines were steady, getting steadier. On the bench beside her, the teacup sat in the autumn sunlight, the first cup that had not spilled, not shattered, not been set aside. Held, drunk, set down by a woman whose hands were learning to be still again. Autumn deepened. The Thornfield garden turned gold and red, and Eleanor drew the oak tree every morning. Not the same view 400 times. Different views, from different angles, with different light. The world was no longer a window frame. It was infinite. Rosalind worked in her sitting room on the London Petition cases her father had referred. Henry carried her legal folder because she was teaching him commitment law, and carrying the folder was homework. Rosalind said one afternoon, The Alderton counter-assessment has been formally stricken from the record. Henry replied, Good. His assessment was circular. He prescribed medication to a condition he never independently diagnosed. Circular authority is not medical evidence. Rosalind looked up from her notes. You sound like my father. Henry said, I sound like you. You sound like your father. He simply arrived first. Eleanor, sitting on the grass with a drawing board in her lap, looked up. She has a point. Your wife has been herself for approximately 8 weeks. Give her time to calibrate. Henry said, Everyone in this family is calibrating. Eleanor replied, Everyone in this family spent years performing. Calibration is what follows performance. It takes time. I have been calibrating for 12 years. I am ahead of both of you. She returned to her drawing. The oak tree, steady lines. A woman who was learning that the world contained things that had been standing the whole time she was inside. Rosalind sat on the grass beside Eleanor's bench. Not on the bench, on the ground, where she had sat the first day in Eleanor's room at Willowbank. the position she had chosen when she decided she was not a visitor. Henry sat beside her, on the ground. The Duke on the grass, the solicitor's daughter on the grass, the woman on the bench above them, drawing a tree that no one had locked, no one had medicated, no one had visited on a schedule and called it love. The gates of Willowbank were 14 miles away. They were closed. Eleanor was here. The sky was open. Everything held. That night, Rosalind lay beside Henry in the darkness of the ducal bedchamber. The window was open. She would not sleep in a room with sealed windows again. The autumn air moved the curtains, and moonlight fell across the bed in slanted silver. Henry's hand found hers. She turned toward him, and his arm came around her, pulling her close. Her back against his chest, his chin resting on her head, their breathing synchronized. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour that started everything, Henry spoke in his sleep. Not Eleanor. Rosalind. The name surfaced with the same tenderness she had heard 11 weeks ago, lying in this bed, listening to him love someone else. But now the tenderness was hers, earned through 4 weeks of legal strategy in a courtroom where she had watched a woman walk free, earned through sitting on a floor and keeping a promise. Rosalind was awake. She heard it. She did not mention it in the morning. She did not need to. She carried it the way Eleanor carried the memory of rain, proof that closed things eventually opened. The sky above Thornfield was full of stars, and the gates that had held Eleanor for 12 years were 14 miles away, and might as well have been on another continent. The woman who had walked through them was drawing oak trees in the garden, drinking tea with too much sugar, and planning to attend a concert on Thursday, where she might have an episode and did not care, because the risk was hers to take. And in the ducal bedchamber, a solicitor's daughter who had been married for utility lay in her husband's arms and heard her name spoken with tenderness, and understood that the most useful thing she had ever done was the thing no one had asked her to do. She had opened a door, and everyone had walked through.